Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome once again to another American Spaces on Air, an initiative brought to you by the American Space at Instituto Chileno Norteamericano in Santiago, the American Academy of Science and Technology from Universidad de Talca, and the Fulbright Commission in Chile, with the support of the American Spaces Network in Chile and the United States Embassy in Santiago. Today, we have a very, very special guest. His name is Edward Carter, and he's a journalist, lawyer, and Brighamyoung University professor of communications. He has authored more than 36 academic journal articles on media law and free expression. He has taught communications law at BYU since 2004. He has represented journalists and others in state and federal courts, and he served as an expert witness in free expression cases in Utah and New Hampshire. He holds academic degrees from BYU, Northern University, the University of Edinburgh, and Oxford University. Ed, how are you today?
I'm doing really well, thank you. It's great to be with you, and it's a pleasure to participate in this program.
Awesome. It's very nice for us to have you here. So I would like to ask you, since when are you living here in Chile?
Well, I got here at the 1st of August this year, and I'm doing a 4-month Fulbright Scholar project. So I'll be finishing in December. And it's really been great to be here and doing this project. So I'm enjoying it a lot.
Perfect. And where specifically in Chile are you right now?
So my Fulbright project is at the Universidad del Desarrollo in San Carlos de Apoquindo, Santiago. But I've also spent some time in Concepcion. The journalism program of UDD has a site in Concepcion. And I've been traveling around the country because part of my project is getting to know different people and places.
Perfect. And why did you choose to come to Chile for your Fulbright program?
Well, I have had a collaboration with scholars at the Universidad del Desarrollo for the last 8 years. The first time I came to Chile was in 2014, and it was a Fulbright specialist project. So I was here for 6 weeks at that time, and I developed some relationships. And so ever since then, I've been coming to Chile every year for a week or two, and we've had people from different universities that we've hosted at our university in Utah, and we've built some really nice collaborations and partnerships. So it was a natural, I think, thing for me to apply for the Fulbright in Chile with, having been here and had some experience here. But also, I was very interested in the whole process surrounding the plebiscito and news coverage and media information about the vote that happened in September.
Perfect. And could you explain a little bit of what your current project is about?
Yes, so the project really consists of two major things, and one is researching the disinformation that happens in the media space, especially surrounding the plebiscito, and of course in the United States we've just had a midterm election yesterday, and so we see some of the different things that happen relating to that. So I've been working on a book with some scholars here at Universidad del Desarrollo, and we've just sent it to the press. It will be published in December, and I wrote one of the chapters, and the focus is on combating disinformation, and specifically I was focused on journalism and how journalism can help cut through some of the confusion and disinformation that's out there. So that's one major aspect of the project, but I'm also doing a second part which has to do with safety of journalists and fighting impunity and attacks on journalists. So I'm organizing an international symposium with scholars from here in Chile, United States, Ukraine, Nigeria, Uganda, Georgia, United Kingdom, and we're going to be meeting in about a week, and everybody's going to be sharing their research on the topic of safety of journalists and combating impunity for attacks on journalists. So that's kind of the second major part of my project. But both of those things tie together around the role of journalism in society and the importance of freedom of the press, but also obviously accountability and responsibility in communicating information.
Absolutely. Basically, everything that you're working on is super, 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 super important for a society to function correctly. We need access to free information, but at the same time, this information should be, the people communicating this information should be accountable for what they communicate, but they should also do it safely. The environment should be safe for them to report on the things that are happening around us. So that is everything. All of that is super, super important.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it all kind of comes out of the baseline of that freedom of expression is protected in Chile, in the United States, and also in international law. But the reason, there are various reasons or values behind that protection, and we protect journalism in society, for example, because it keeps us informed about information that we need to make decisions and policies to support and candidates to vote for. But also it keeps government in check in terms of its use of power, and serves various societal goals. And so I think sometimes politicians have successfully convinced large portions of the population that journalists are just enemies of the people, or are engaged in fake news, and they need to be punished, and journalists are sometimes scapegoated. But I think that's a very dangerous thing to happen in society. Now, of course, journalists are not perfect. There are mistakes that happen, and there should be corrections and accountability, and there should be efforts to get the information correct and accurate. But the point is that journalists generally are engaged in the public service of trying to gather and disseminate truthful and accurate information on important topics. And so it's to the benefit of all of us to understand how journalism works, and understand how to get high quality information, and then recognize when there's low quality information that we should disregard or work to correct. And so I think for all citizens, it really is becoming a critical skill to function in society. We need to be able to be news literate and understand how to cut through some of the confusion out there.
Perfect. And speaking about news literacy, as a lawyer and as a communicator, tell us how you started on news literacy, and why it is important for people to improve their awareness on this matter.
Sure. Well, so in my own life and career, I started out as a newspaper reporter for 4 years. I was working as a journalist, and I saw how it was difficult to sort through lots of complex pieces of information, and recognize what's valuable and high value and truthful. And then I went to law school and became a lawyer. And as you said in the introduction, I've done some representation of news organizations and journalists. And what I've realized in all of that time is that in the United States, we have extraordinary protection for journalists under the First Amendment. And in international law, we have really strong protections for journalists under the Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And Chile also protects the right to freedom of expression and the press. But all of those things really are useless if people stop believing in the value of journalism and freedom of the press. So the law does not execute itself, right? It requires us as citizens, as community members, as leaders to understand and believe in and support and promote those principles, because we think society is better when we have transparency, when we have a variety of voices in the media space. And so I think educating ourselves about that is critical, because I honestly believe that if people stop fighting for the right to free press, it can just go away, right? It will just It will just disappear if we don't think it's important and we don't continue to uphold it. And so, that's kind of what I've tried to do in my career as a journalist, as a lawyer, and as an educator, is to advance the notion that societies are better, are more sustainable, are more resilient if we have vigorous journalism happening. Now, of course, journalists sometimes rub people the wrong way and say, write and publish and broadcast things that people are unhappy about, or sometimes could be offensive or perceived to be harmful. And of course, there are legal repercussions, if something is truly defamatory or invasive of privacy or violation of some kind of other law. So there are definitely limits to that. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't scapegoat journalists or, threaten them or drive them to leave journalism. And unfortunately, that's what happens in some communities, in some societies, is journalists are threatened or even killed for just basically doing their jobs and what they think is right for their communities.
Absolutely. And we would also be in a difficult situation if all the news and all the coverage came from one source or just a couple of sources, right? If we gave control of all of the information to just one media outlet, for example.
Exactly. No, you're exactly right. And if I could just say on that, since you bring up, that's a really important point. There's a concept called the marketplace of ideas. It comes from a Supreme Court case in the United States in 1919, and there was a dissenting opinion written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, and he was basically defending the right of 5 Russian anarchists or revolutionists who had thrown some flyers out of building windows in New York City during World War I, and they were criticizing President Woodrow Wilson, criticizing the U.S. government effort in the war in Russia and in Germany. But the point is, Justice Holmes said, look, these people were not trying to overthrow the government. They weren't doing a revolution. They weren't actually causing harm. They were just expressing their opinion. And even if their opinion is wrong, they have a right, to say it, as long as it's not defamatory or otherwise violating the law. And that marketplace of ideas concept, I think, is what you just suggested, that we should have a variety of viewpoints expressed. And of course, some of them are going to be more valuable, more accurate than others. But having more voices is generally good. And the marketplace is supposed to be able to correct itself. If something is not true or not helpful or not accurate, then as a society, collectively, we need to be wise enough to recognize that and to correct or fix the problem. And so that's kind of the basis of, freedom of the press and freedom of expression, is allowing people to say what they want to say, but then we correct that. We correct it if there's a problem. Of course, the marketplace is not perfect, and sometimes it's flawed. And right now, what we're seeing in the world, in Chile, in the United States, and elsewhere, is 2 types of disinformation. There's intentional disinformation, and then there's unintentional disinformation. And I can talk some more about that, but I think it's important to recognize that there's a difference between somebody who's saying something false and they're saying it knowingly, that knowing that it's false, versus somebody who makes an error in good faith, trying to say something that they thought was true, but then making a mistake. There's an important difference there.
Yes, where the two usually come together in our modern times is when someone spreads information on purpose, misinformation, and then people usually don't check and reshare that information, not knowing that it's false. So that's also a huge problem that could be combated. And that brings me to another question, right? So it is the responsibility of journalists to share accurate information and do proper research and all of those things. That's their responsibility. But what is the responsibility of the audience consuming the information? How should we handle the information that we receive?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think one of the important things there is not to get into our echo chambers. I mean, on social media, we have algorithms that feed us information that we probably already identify with. I mean, the algorithm knows what kind of messages I like to get on Facebook, on Instagram, or on Twitter. And so I'm receiving things that the algorithm is telling me that I like or that I want. And so, but we have to be careful with that, because it could easily lead us into, these bubbles or echo chambers where we forget that there are other people out there who see things differently. And so I think one of our responsibilities as media consumers, which we all are, is to be open to a variety of viewpoints and not to get stuck into our bubbles, with our social media algorithms. And so we have to consciously go out and seek information. Now, I'm not saying consciously go out and seek false information, but consciously go out and seek sources of information that are different than what I traditionally would choose to pay attention to, and then be open to learning new things. Like I think as a consumer of media, I want to have high quality information, but I also want to learn new things from new sources all the time that I maybe haven't been exposed to before. And so I think we have to be proactive about that, about seeking valuable, high value information. So that's one point for sure. And then, the second thing I would say is that if you're not paying for media as a subscriber, that's okay, right? There is a business model where advertising pays for it, and that's traditionally been what has supported journalism. But increasingly in the social media space, consumers are really the product. So instead of the news content being delivered to us alongside of advertising in order to support the news, really what we're getting is the eyeballs of the consumers are being sold to advertisers. So consumers are really the product that's being sold, and the social media sphere is built to hold our attention so that advertisers get more of our time. And so we have to be, I think, a little careful with that, to know if I'm not paying for it, I'm the product, I'm not actually the consumer. But if I'm a subscriber to a service, then we could be more confident that there's something that's being provided to me as a consumer that I'm paying for that could be valuable information. Now, of course, there is valuable free information on news organizations, websites and social media channels. But what I'm seeing is increasingly, to get high value information, consumers need to be willing to pay a subscription fee. And then, I think just generally in the news literacy space, it's important to recognize, again, the difference that I mentioned with disinformation. Well, the Congressional Research Service in the United States has made a definition of disinformation versus misinformation. And they're two different things. Disinformation is intentionally false, and misinformation is unintentionally false. And so if somebody is doing, intentional propaganda and falsehood, that's disinformation, we need to be able to recognize that and know, okay, that's really not helping me get closer to the truth. Somebody might have a right to do that. They have a right to free expression. And sometimes that includes, spreading lies and disinformation, but I shouldn't really internalize that. But I should recognize that if there's misinformation, like let's say a journalist does the best work that they can, but makes a mistake, and there's something that's inaccurate. Well, I don't put the misinformation or the innocent error in the same category as propaganda or disinformation. And so I think we have to recognize that for the most part, actual journalists might make mistakes, but those are unintentional. Whereas there are obviously partisan groups and certain interest groups and individuals who could be spreading disinformation, and we should, draw, I think, a line between those two things.
Absolutely. And speaking about freedom of information, today, November 9, is the World Freedom Day. How could you explain in simple words the connection between freedom and news literacy?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, there's an old saying that freedom is not free, right? And so we obviously have to work for it in order to preserve the freedoms that we have, or the liberties and rights that we enjoy. And I've touched on this a little bit already, but in terms of freedom of the press, I think that our responsibility as consumers is to understand and support good journalism, but recognize what's not actually journalism. And so, that I think enhances our freedom, because it's promoting the high value information that we get from journalists. And defining what is journalism turns out to be a really tricky thing, but I define it as independent gathering and disseminating of news and information in the public interest on relevant topics. So, if you pick that apart, I mean, journalism is independent because it's not in the service of any particular political party or candidate or company or public interest group. That doesn't mean journalists are totally objective like computers and detached from society. I mean, we are human beings, but independence is a really important sign of actual journalism. So if I see information coming from a political party, that might be something I want to pay attention to, or it might not be, but I definitely know it's not journalism. It's not done with the intent of providing an independent perspective. And then, the other parts of the definition I mentioned, I mean, disseminating news and information in the public interest. So the journalist is not thinking about what advances their own career or what is in alignment with their own interests, but really is thinking about what does my audience need and want to know about this topic, and what can I provide that's of value. And so if you take that definition that I gave, then the amount of journalism in the wider media space is pretty focused and narrow, right? Like you could take, for example, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN Chile, TVN, I mean, any cable TV, programming. And most of what happens on that cable TV programming is not journalism. Now, I'm not saying it's irrelevant or unhelpful, but it could be commentary, debate, discussion, but that's in a different category, I think, than the actual reporting of news and information. So what I try to do is focus on news content being given to me in an independent way and really understand that, versus, maybe I put a lower priority on debate, commentary, discussion, opinion, shouting, shout shows that happen when people are kind of yelling at each other. I don't really think that's of such a high value. And so I think consumers, need to be focused on that.
Okay, so something very interesting that we have been discussing today is the fact that quality information is usually not free. You have to pay for it, right? And that's a way to identify that you are receiving quality information. What are some other ways to identify that the journalism that or that the news that you are consuming are high quality?
Yeah, great question. Well, it can be obviously very challenging because there are a lot of messages that come in the form of journalism, like they're dressed up as if they were journalism, and they're actually not. So, for example, I mean, I would take social media. Let's take Twitter, for example. So Twitter is used by a lot of journalists to share news and information that I think is of a high value, but there's also a lot of other stuff that's on there that's of lower value, and it can be really difficult from one tweet to the other to know what am I getting here. And then there's also a lot of parody and satire and just joking and entertainment and stuff like that, and that's all fine. But well, I tend to think that journalism, it can happen. It can happen by individuals, freelancers, even regular citizens, right? Like they don't have to go to journalism school or work for a news organization, but for the most part, the really good, high quality information that's given over time comes from organizations where they are going to have enough resources to support investigative reporting and independent reporting. And so, I mean, there are some respected news organizations that I pay attention to. I think The Atlantic in Washington, D.C. is a really good magazine that has independent news reporting and does a good job of covering multiple aspects of various stories, other established news organizations that I pay attention to. I mean, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times. And I mean, I think some people in Chile know some of the history of El Mercurio and Copesa and some of the news organizations, and there are various good and maybe not so good aspects to the history there and everything like that. But for the most part, I see high quality news coming from El Mercurio and from CNN Chile and from the clinic. There's other kind of other news organizations. I mean, I think Radio Bio does some really good work, and such recognized news organizations I think tend to be more reliable than, say, just a guy on Twitter or somebody with an Instagram page or something like that. So it's not a foolproof way, but I do think we can generally be more trusting of larger news organizations that have a track record of doing independent reporting.
Perfect. Okay, and going to a lighter subject for a little while. So you mentioned that you have been to Chile before, right?
Yes.
Okay, so how good is your Spanish?
Más o menos.
Okay.
Yo enseño y hago investigaciones en español, pero con un acento de gringo. Entonces, algunas personas me dicen, no te entiendo, pero por la mayoría de la gente se entiende. Me gusta hablar español y tratar de entender la cultura, y me gusta mucho la comida, los paisajes. Bueno, Chile tiene mucho para ofrecer y he viajado un poco al sur, al norte. Estuve en San Pedro de Atacama, estuve en Punta Arenas. Este fin de semana estuve a las Torres del Paine y hace una semana fui a Rapa Nui. Entonces, hay muchos lugares muy lindos y me gusta, bueno, la gente tiene paciencia conmigo cuando estoy tratando de hablar español.
La mejor parte de los acentos es que siempre hay una historia detrás del acento, así que siempre podemos conocer un poco más de las personas que estamos conociendo cuando hablan un idioma distinto. Y eso es fantástico.
Sí, es cierto. Yo siempre cuento a las personas aquí que vivo en Utah, que es un estado en el oeste de los Estados Unidos, cerca de Nevada y California, pero tenemos montañas, desiertos, podemos esquiar. Es muy parecido a Chile, menos el mar. No tenemos el mar, pero sí tenemos otras cosas muy parecidas.
So Utah is kind of a Chile light. Something like that.
Yes, exactly.
Very good. Fantastic. I haven't been to Utah yet. I hope one day I can visit Utah.
Yes, it's a beautiful place.
Perfect. Now, talking about Chile and the United States, which similarities do you see between the American and the Chilean culture in general? And more specifically, also around literacy.
Sure. Well, like I said, I was watching closely the plebiscito and the discussion, news coverage, and campaigning leading up to the vote in September. And I guess I would say, unfortunately, we're seeing some similarities in Chile with what's been happening in the United States last 6-8 years in terms of disinformation campaigns. I mean, I think that there were some calculated disinformation campaigns during the election leading up to the plebiscito. I don't think it was maybe at the same level as, for example, what we saw in the United States in 2016 with the presidential election. There were Russian bots who were doing a lot of disinformation on Facebook, on Twitter about the campaign. And I don't think it's reached that level yet, but there definitely are some tendencies toward disinformation that are concerning. And so that's, I think, a similarity that's unfortunate, but is something, I guess there is an opportunity for us to to learn a little bit from the United States about what to avoid in Chile. What we don't want to have happen, or what we don't want to allow happen, is the same level of maybe political division and people hardening in their positions to an extent that they don't get along with their neighbors or family members, or they can't relate to people who have different beliefs than them. And I think that's unfortunate, because one of the things that has made the United States great for its history is it's a melting pot of cultures. And it should be, it's been traditionally very open to immigration, incorporation of new cultures and new people. And that openness is a good thing. But I see that changing a little bit in the United States with this political, division that's become so just so hardened. And I hope that doesn't happen in Chile. I mean, I think here there's obviously now increased immigration. I go to play basketball in the Parque Araucano in Santiago, and there's people from Venezuela and Haiti and all kinds of countries. And I love going there because I feel like on the basketball court, we're all the same. It doesn't matter where you're from, what color your skin is, how much education you have. We can relate to each other. But in society, I realize, I know that it's not quite that simple, but I just think that would be good to be incorporating new cultures, new people. And of course, it has to be done in a legal and, orderly way. But it's just, I think, unfortunate that we kind of see this political division happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. And let's see. Yeah. And that is something that's very interesting from what you were saying is the division that misinformation creates. So I would like to ask you if not misinformation, but if radicalization you think might be a product of misinformation.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think showing the cause and effect there is always going to be challenging, but to me, it definitely seems like there is a link. I mean, we have, anecdotal examples, so I'll just share one of those. And this is not to say that, it proves the point, but a few weeks ago, there was a situation in Florida where the FBI conducted some people call it a raid, but there was a search warrant that was executed at President Trump's home, Mar-a-Lago. It's actually a resort, right? A hotel, but he lives there in Florida. And the FBI, got a judge to sign the warrant. And so there was evidence that there were classified documents that he had there that he shouldn't have had. And so they recovered the documents, and obviously that's been subject to litigation. There's a lot of, political debate about that. But the bottom line is it was a legal search under a search warrant. It wasn't the deep state, seeking to harm President Trump for political reasons or anything like that. But there were some people who I think had been radicalized enough and were convinced, this was just evidence that the government's out to get Trump. And there was actually a man in Ohio who died while attacking an FBI field office, and there was evidence that he had been convinced that the government was out to get Trump, and we're in the end times, and we're having a civil war, and we need to go, attack the FBI with weapons. Now, that was just one example, and I hope that doesn't happen, broadly or more widespread. But I definitely think that some people have become, so convinced of the position that they're in politically that it can lead to unnecessary violence or radicalization. And sometimes, like I said earlier, those attacks are taken out on journalists. I mean, attacks can happen online, so verbal attacks, but those could also sometimes lead to physical attacks. And there's research about some links between the verbal online harassment and abuse that happens and the physical attacks that happen. And unfortunately, one of the things that's been shown is that online harassment and verbal attacks tend to happen more so to women and minorities. So journalists who are women and minorities bear the brunt of attacks more so than, say, white men. And so that's just an unfortunate, I think, thing that we see happening. And we're trying to find ways, like I mentioned, this international symposium that I'm organizing with other scholars. We're just trying to find ways to understand the problem and the solutions better. Like one researcher is looking at how to identify early warning signs of physical violence by examining or analyzing social media messages, and is there something that we can do before it reaches a level of physical violence once we recognize verbal harassment online.
Perfect. And related to all of this, what do you think are the main challenges or opportunities when it comes to responsible free expression and responsible journalism?
Yes. Well, I've probably mentioned enough of the challenges, and I don't want to seem like I'm pessimistic. So let me go with the opportunities. And I appreciate you bringing that up, because I am generally an optimistic person. And I think that there is a lot of reason for optimism and hope right now. I mean, really, if you look at the history of journalism in the modern times, there's probably never been a time when we have as much high quality information and journalism available to us as we do now. So that's actually a very positive thing. Of course, there's also a lot of other stuff, like I said, that we have to sift through to get to the high quality information. But it's a nice thing to know that there is good information out there and we can access it. We have multimedia tools at our disposal on our phones, readily accessible to many people. And so as long as we educate ourselves about how to do that, we have this great resource for informing ourselves, perhaps like never before in the history of the modern world. And so that's a very positive thing. And then I guess the other reason I would say I'm optimistic is that I get to work with college age students, and I'm teaching a journalism class here right now at Universidad del Desarrollo. I teach my students in Utah at BYU, and every time I interact with young people, college age students, I'm really, my hope is renewed, my hope in humanity, because they are just great enthusiasm for life and the world, and they have great hopes for the future, and lots of talent and ability and just goodness. I can really sense, the goodness in these students. And so I feel like the future is in good hands. If we can make it a little better, then of course we want to do that. But in general, I think that there's lots of reasons to be happy and optimistic about the sources of information available to us, and about the people who will be future journalists and leaders in our communities.
Perfect. I love that you're being optimist. That's what we all need.
Yes.
Very good. Now, it is more common nowadays to see people choosing, and we discussed this a little bit, choosing media outlets that fit their own beliefs or that they feel right to them. So, are feelings more important than facts nowadays, or it should be the other way around?
Yeah, that's a super interesting point, or interesting question. Well, I mean, as a journalist, I'm really focused on facts. I mean, I think that facts do exist. I think the truth does exist, and we can discover it little by little. Of course, we have to chip away at that. I mean, it doesn't all become uncovered at once. On a big story, it takes time for facts and truths to come out. But I really feel like, I mean, there's an old saying, and I think it's attributed to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a former senator from New York, that each of us is entitled to our own opinions, but we're not entitled to our own facts, right? And so I can have feelings and I can have my opinions, but I shouldn't pretend like those are actual facts. And I think sometimes people today are conflating their feelings or their opinions with the facts. I mean, I guess I might be naive or simplistic, but I think the facts are the same for everybody. The truth is the same for everybody. And we just have to choose to recognize or not. And so I don't really believe in alternative facts. I mean, there's only a set of facts, and so we ought to, I think, recognize that. And sometimes it requires some humility. Like I might have to admit, hey, I just learned something new. I was wrong before. I thought something was true, and now I discovered that it's not. And so that takes a certain amount of humility and willingness to admit that we were wrong. And unfortunately, some leaders in our society are just never willing to admit that they were wrong, and they don't seem willing to learn new things. I think we can set a better example of how to do that, because that I think that's a key thing is constantly learning, and part of that process is realizing that whatever we thought before was perhaps not fully informed.
Absolutely. And as people, we also have a responsibility to not just conform with the things that we're reading, right? For example, if I was someone who enjoyed eating apples and I read that in a news outlet that apples are good for you, but then in another that apples are bad for you, maybe I should go to a doctor and ask if it's okay to eat apples every day, right? I should go and check with the expert and not trust anything I read on the internet.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, there is kind of a distrust in society of expertise, and I mean, I get why that happens. I understand that some people don't want to be told what to do or what's good for them. They want to make their own decisions and everything. But I think that experts can be helpful, and we don't have to blindly follow them, but certainly we shouldn't disregard them. I mean, an expert is just as worthy of my attention, if not more so, than a non-expert. I mean, that's the thing that kind of, I think, is ironic. Some people who don't believe in following experts, well, who are they going to follow? A person who is ignorant, and that's worse, right? And so yeah, I mean, I think some trust in expertise is good. I mean, scientists, researchers, scholars, doctors, people who have experience are going to be worthy of our attention. And what I tell students in journalism is, look, we should apply a healthy skepticism to things that we're told, but not cynicism. I think cynicism is harmful to our psyche, our life, because it just makes us pessimistic and we think the world is just hopeless. But to be skeptical is okay. That just means that I want to verify things. I want to check things out. I want to have multiple sources of information. And so if in the example that you used, if I read a study and it says, hey, apples are good for you, then I think, okay, well, that's great. I'm glad to know that. But also, I'm going to research a little bit more. Let me read, a couple more things about that. Let me know the background of that study, understand the limitations of it. And so skepticism would just lead me to say, I'm going to find out for myself and try to verify what I can. But not totally disregard the not think I can do it all myself. Like I might not know about the fix, so I have to trust the expert somewhat.
Absolutely. And when there are algorithms feeding you exactly the type of news that you want to read, maybe you can also have limitations looking for more information. So yes, it is important to just keep trying to search for new sources. And regarding that bit of information right there, we have a question from YouTube from Antonia Ronda that I am going to share on the screen. So she says, hey Ed, your Spanish is great. My question for you is, how do you think that this information affects on young adults when it comes to everyday life? Do you think they're the main target of it?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Y gracias por el comentario sobre mi español. Well, so yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I will admit, I have not researched that specific issue, but I'll share a few thoughts about it, and then I'm going to take a note of it because that would be a really interesting thing to do some more research about. I think I would say that, there are differences in disinformation being targeted to older people versus younger people. I mean, everybody has kind of this, and this is kind of a cliche example, but everybody has this crazy uncle on Facebook who post, conspiracy theories or things, wild things about whatever. And what I kind of think about that is, well, of course the person has a right to do that, but I don't share those things. It's not always an uncle, but sometimes it's like an older relative or neighbor or something. And I feel like, maybe they're naive about where this information comes from. Maybe they're not really clued in to the fact that, hey, there are, evil sources out there actually trying to deceive you. So not everything you see is going to be accurate and true. And I guess they could be a little gullible about it. But, I think in terms of young people, it's a little different, because young people tend to be pretty savvy. I mean, they aren't as experienced in the world, but they are pretty savvy about messages that come to them, because, they've been exposed to Instagram or TikTok for years. And so I think they have a certain jaded attitude toward it. Like they're not gullible, right? They actually tend to be kind of the opposite, where they're pretty skeptical or maybe even cynical, like I was just talking about. And so young people probably, can disregard a certain amount of information. But I actually find that they do struggle to, well, just like anybody, but, they do struggle at times to recognize what is high value information, because there's so many sources thrown at them. And, I could watch hours and hours of dancing videos on TikTok, and I just become like hardened to information, like my eyes are glazed over, my brain is fried, and I don't really pay attention to a news story about the war in Ukraine, or maybe, poverty happening in certain parts of the world or something. And so I think there's a certain amount of just overabundance of information that happens for young people, and so then it's hard for them to pay attention. But yeah, really good question, and I'm going to make a note of that so I can look into it a little bit more. I do think young people are targets of a lot of disinformation for sure.
Awesome. Thank you, Antonio, for your question. And of course, thank you, Ed, for the answer. I think we have another one. Yes, this one arrived from the American Space at Antofagasta, and we have been touching on this subject a bit, but they say, ¿qué mirada tiene respecto al rol y la ética periodística actual? ¿Hay búsqueda de la verdad o son solo generadores de contenido para satisfacer a la audiencia?
Yeah, buena pregunta. Primero quiero decir que yo fui a Antofagasta una vez y me gustó mucho, muy lindo lugar. Entonces, saludos a los que están allá en Antofagasta. Y voy a intentar contestarlo en español, ya que la pregunta vino en español, pero me dices si no se me entiende. Creo que están sucediendo las dos cosas. O sea, hay periodistas que están trabajando mucho para buscar la verdad y publicarla, y están haciéndolo de una manera independiente en el interés del público. Eso está pasando. Yo conozco muchos periodistas que dedican sus vidas a hacerlo. No lo hacen por dinero, no lo hacen por llegar a ser famosos. Lo hacen porque creen en la prensa y en el rol de la prensa en la sociedad. Y eso sí sucede. Pero a la vez sucede la otra cosa en la pregunta, que hay también personas nada más enfocadas en generar contenido. Desafortunadamente, algunas organizaciones de periodismo se han perdido un poco y han cambiado su forma y se enfocaron demasiado en el contenido que obtiene clics, y creo que eso está mal, porque el periodismo no es siempre popular, pero es importante, ¿no? Y creo que una cosa que debemos hacer es encontrar formas de pagar los gastos del periodismo que no dependen de muchos clics, ¿no es cierto? Porque lo que va a traer los clics no es siempre la información importante que necesitamos. Y bueno, hay formas de pagar los gastos de periodismo, hay fundaciones, hay organizaciones sin fines de lucro. Hay también en algunos países el gobierno da dinero para ayudar al periodismo o sostener al periodismo y pienso que todas esas formas tenemos que seguir desarrollando para que el periodismo pueda ser independiente, aún independiente de la necesidad de ganar dinero, si es posible.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And we are reaching now the end of the interview, so I still have two questions. And the first one of those is: as the world becomes more and more globalized and more content is being shared, do you think that it will be harder to fact check information sources in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think so. I think, we obviously live in a really complex world, and sometimes it feels really close because, again, I can be on Twitter and I can see a video on YouTube from any country and I can feel like, hey, I'm close to that situation, but things can be really complex. Like I mentioned, the war in Ukraine, I've read a lot about it, but I've never been there. I don't really know what's happening on the ground, and so it could be easy for me to be deceived about that because maybe I'm just paying attention to one source of information. I mean, I generally think it's pretty clear in that situation that, Russia is being an aggressor and needs to stop. And there have been human rights violations. It's pretty clear there's been a lot of good journalism about that. But it's still crazy to me that there are some people who believe and say they believe that somehow Ukraine is in the wrong and Russia is fine and is okay and hasn't done anything wrong. I mean, there are people apparently confused about that, or maybe willfully, confused about it. And so I guess it is hard, to know the truth. But I think we should, I don't know, I think we should use our common sense and just, do the best that we can and just know that if a politician says Russia is doing good, well, what's the reason why they would say that? Are they receiving donations, money? Is there some kind of corruption happening there? That's, again, where verification and skepticism would come in to my mind. And I would say, well, I'm going to research why this guy is saying that because that doesn't feel right.
Perfect. We have just received another question from social media that I think is very relevant. We have touched on it as well a couple of times, but here we go. Okay, it's in English as well. So, hello, I want to thank you for this interview and sharing your opinion regarding disinformation and misinformation. My question is, how or what's the best way to counter misinformation beside rectificate the source of the news, or what tips do you recommend in order to validate information?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Danielle. Great question. Well, I mean, I'm going to suggest a couple of things there. I think obviously when we're interacting on social media, it can be very easy for us to be aggressive or strident. Like sometimes I see somebody responding to a news story and they say, hey, you journalist, you're an idiot. You're stupid because you got this wrong. And why are you such a, jerk and everything? And what I think is, look, the journalist might be a fine person. Maybe they just made a mistake. And so let's not jump right to saying you're an idiot and you're a jerk and you're, stupid. Maybe just civility would be important there to say, look, I think you got something wrong. Here's the source of the information that tells you what would be accurate. And I would appreciate if you could, correct this. So civility, I think, is one thing. We all need to be able to have dialogue with each other. I mean, if the marketplace of ideas is really going to work, it has to be a collaborative dialogue where we do correct each other and we do try to fix things that are inaccurate, but not in such an aggressive, mean way. And then I guess the other thing that relates to that is just, I feel like journalists and their communities need to be more connected. And it's a two-way street. The journalists need to do more to reach out to people in the community, but also people in the community can proactively contact journalists and have a dialogue there. I mean, social media does allow us to do that. And if it's done in a civil way, it can be really productive. I also feel like a lot of us pay attention to national news. So I'm reading about what's President Biden doing or what's President Boric doing today. But the local community is where a lot of decisions are made. And so local citizens should get to know their mayors, their city councilors, their local representatives, and they can have an impact that way. If you can have a dialogue with those people, you can actually make a difference in the world. And then also, like I said, do the same with journalists to correct anything that might be inaccurate. So thanks for the question, Danielle. I like the premise that we can be collaborative about it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Daniel. And on this regard, I would also like to share that we would like to invite our audience to the launch of the program Verifica tus Medios, developed by the American Corner at Universidad Diego Portales with their journalism school, which provides tools for teachers and general audiences to verify their sources of information. The launch of this program, Verifica tus Medios, will take place tomorrow, November 10, in Santiago at Biblioteca Nicanor Parra, near Los Héroes Metro Station. Very good. Ed, one final question. What would be some advice for our audience on this matter, on the matter of media literacy?
Yeah, well, first of all, I will just say, I'm glad you mentioned Verifica tus Medios. And if anybody goes there or watches that program, you're probably going to see me again, because I'm going to be on the panel tomorrow at Diego Portales, awesome. Talking about these issues a little bit. But I'm really glad to see that the Universidad Diego Portales and others are launching this effort, because it's really critical to the future of our society. I'll just go back from kind of my final comment. I will go back to the Marketplace of Ideas and Justice Holmes from 1919 in the case of Abrams versus United States. I mentioned that before, but Justice Holmes not only talked about the Marketplace of Ideas, but he also said that truth is the only ground on which it's safe to base our decisions. I'm paraphrasing a little bit there, but the phrase truth is the only ground has always stuck with me, because it's not safe for us as individuals or for us as a society to base decisions on alternative facts or on feelings or on political tribalism or what we wish were true. We have to actually base our decisions on what is the truth. And so that requires some hard work, to understand the truth and support it. And even if it requires us to change our positions, but it's the only safe way to do it. So my hope, my encouragement is just for all of us to do the hard work required to understand truth and then act on it.
Very good. So we can conclude that it is important to follow paid sources of news, follow a diverse group of sources of news, even if they are not, even if you don't have to pay for them. You need to support the truth, and those are the main things that we need to make sure that we are getting quality information. So, Ed, thank you very much for spending this hour with us, talking to us about this important subject. It was a wonderful conversation. I think everyone in the audience can agree. And it was a pleasure having you here. And I'll see you tomorrow at the event.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody who's listening. Bye.
Bye-bye.